my son, said that I would get nothing from my ex-wife's 34th wedlock. Wilbert the lawyer laughed and said, I am Donald, 62 years old, a retired high school teacher who never expected to be sitting in a fancy law office discussing millions of dollars. After 25 years of marriage, Margaret and I divorced. She went on to build a $34 million real estate empire while I continued teaching history at the same school. Our son Richard sided with her after the divorce, drawn to her ambition and wealth. When Margaret suddenly died of a stroke, I was surprised to receive a notice about the will reading. As I entered the lawyer's office, Richard smirked and said, Dad, you won't get a single penny. Before I share the unexpected twist that happened in that law office, let me know where you're watching from and hit subscribe if you believe life sometimes delivers justice in the most surprising ways. I met Margaret back in 1985. I was a young history teacher with a passion for making the past come alive for my students. She worked as an office administrator at a small real estate company. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue, and I was immediately drawn to her quick wit and infectious laugh. Margaret had this way of making everyone around her feel special, and I was no exception. You teach history? She had asked, her eyes lighting up. I always found it boring in school, but maybe you could change my mind. That was all the invitation I needed. We talked for hours that night, and by the end, I had her phone number and a date planned for the following weekend. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Within a year, we were married in a small ceremony with just our closest friends and family. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood with good schools. Our plan was to fill those bedrooms with children, but life had other ideas. We struggled with fertility issues for several years before Margaret finally became pregnant with Richard. The day Richard was born was the happiest day of my life. I remember holding him in my arms, this tiny human, with my chin and Margaret's bright blue eyes, and feeling a love so overwhelming it brought me to tears. Margaret and I created our own little world, centered around our son. We took family vacations to national parks, had Sunday pancake traditions, and built a life filled with laughter and warmth. For the first decade of our marriage, things were wonderful. Margaret was a devoted mother, and I thought I was the luckiest man alive. We had our disagreements like any couple, but nothing we couldn't work through with a good conversation and sometimes a glass of wine. The change began gradually. When Richard started elementary school, Margaret returned to work at the same real estate company, but with renewed ambition. She had always been smart and capable, but now she seemed driven by something I couldn't quite understand. I want more for us, Donald, she would say. For Richard. Don't you want him to have every opportunity? Of course I did, but our definitions of opportunity seemed to be diverging. While I valued education experiences and character development, Margaret increasingly equated opportunities with material possessions and status. The real turning point came when my parents died in a car accident when Richard was 8. They had been driving to visit us for Christmas when a drunk driver crossed the median. I was devastated. My parents had been my rock, my biggest supporters, and suddenly they were gone. I fell into a deep depression. Getting out of bed became a monumental task. Going to work felt impossible some days. I sought therapy and was prescribed medication, but recovery was slow and painful. Margaret tried to be supportive at first, but her patience wore thin quickly. You need to snap out of it, she said one night, 6 months after the accident. Richard needs a father who is present, not one who can barely function. Her words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because there was some truth to them. I was trying my best, but my best wasn't good enough for her anymore. As I struggled with grief, Margaret threw herself into her career. She got promoted to a junior agent position and started working longer hours. She joined networking groups and professional organizations. She made new friends, wealthy friends with vacation homes and luxury cars. And Richard noticed all of it. He was at an impressionable age, and Margaret's rising status clearly captivated him. When she bought him expensive clothes or the latest gaming system, his eyes would light up in a way they never did when I took him fishing or helped him with his history project. "Mom says if you work hard enough, you can have anything you want," Richard told me one day when he was 12. "That's not exactly true, buddy," I tried to explain. "Hard work is important, but there's also luck, privilege, and circumstances beyond our control. And sometimes the things worth having most aren't things at all." He looked at me with confusion and then disappointment. "Mom says you lack ambition. Is that why you're just a teacher?" Just a teacher. The word stung. I had once been proud of my career of shaping young minds and instilling a love of history. Margaret had once been proud of me too. Now she was poisoning our son against me and the values I held dear. I tried to save our marriage. I suggested counseling date nights, even a second honeymoon. Margaret would agree half-heartedly, then cancel at the last minute because of work commitments. Our home became a place where we merely coexisted, orbiting each other without truly connecting. By the time Richard was 15, the distance between Margaret and me felt insurmountable. And worse, I could feel Richard slipping away, too drawn into his mother's world of ambition and material success, viewing me with increasing disdain. Margaret's career continued to skyrocket. Within 3 years of returning to work, she had become the director of project development for her company. Her boss recognized her talent for spotting promising properties and her persuasive abilities with clients. Her new position required frequent travel, sometimes keeping her away from home for weeks at a time. I became both mother and father to Richard during those absences, driving him to soccer practice, helping with homework, making sure he ate properly. But rather than bringing us closer, these times seemed to highlight my inadequacies in Richard's eyes. "Mom would have let me go to Jason's party," he would say, or "Mom knows how to make the pasta sauce better." One rainy Tuesday evening, I was using Margaret's laptop to pay some bills when a message notification popped up. I had never been the snooping type, never felt the need to check her phone or email. Trust had always been the foundation of our relationship, even as it crumbled in other ways. But something about the sender's name, James Patterson, coupled with the preview text I could see, made my stomach drop. The message read, "Miss you too, 3 more days until Chicago. Can't wait to—" I shouldn't have opened it. Some part of me knew what I would find would forever change my life, my marriage, my family. But I clicked anyway. The conversation between Margaret and James, her company's financial director, spanned months. There were intimate messages, plans for their rendezvous during business trips, and worse discussions about their future together. "Donald is a good man," she had written, "but we've grown in different directions. He's content with his small life. I want more." I sat there for hours reading through years of betrayal, my hands shaking, my vision blurring with tears. When Margaret returned home that night, I confronted her with what I had discovered. I expected denial, anger, perhaps even remorse. What I didn't expect was the calm, almost relieved way she admitted to the affair. "I was going to tell you after Richard's graduation," she said, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, her expression composed. "James and I have been together for nearly 2 years. I think part of you has known something was wrong for a long time. 2 years? My voice sounded strange to my own ears. You've been lying to me, to our son, for 2 years. I haven't been happy, Donald. Not for a long time. You and I both know that. After your parents died, you changed. You withdrew. You were content to stay in your grief and your safe little teaching job, while I wanted to grow to experience more. So this is my fault, I asked incredulously. Because I grieved my parents? Because I dedicated my life to teaching rather than chasing money? She sighed as if I was missing an obvious point. It's not about blame. We've grown apart. I've outgrown this marriage, outgrown. She gestured vaguely toward me. This life. The pain was physical, like a knife twisting in my chest. 25 years of marriage, dismissed so easily. My life's work, my values, my love, all deemed insufficient. The next few weeks were a blur. Margaret moved into a hotel while we sorted out the details. I had hoped to keep the situation between us until we figured things out. But Margaret had already told Richard her version of events. I will never forget the look on my 17-year-old son's face when he confronted me in our living room, his eyes cold with judgment. Mom told me everything, he said. How you checked out of the marriage years ago. How you held her back with your lack of ambition. How she tried to make it work, but you wouldn't change. Richard, that's not what happened. I tried to explain, but he cut me off. Save it, Dad. I've seen it myself for years. Mom built herself up while you stayed exactly the same. You were depressed all the time. You never wanted to do anything exciting or go anywhere nice. You were happy being mediocre. His words cut deeper than Margaret's betrayal. My own son, my flesh and blood, had been turned against me so completely. The divorce was quick and brutal. Margaret hired Thomas Walker, one of the top divorce attorneys in the state. I couldn't afford someone of his caliber on a teacher's salary, so I went with a friend's recommendation, a kind but inexperienced family lawyer named Sarah Jones. Margaret wanted full custody of Richard, who at 17 had already made it clear he wanted to live with his mother. She offered me a settlement that my lawyer advised was far below what I was entitled to after 25 years of marriage, but fighting would mean expensive legal fees I couldn't afford. Just sign the papers, Dad, Richard said during one of our increasingly rare conversations. Stop making this harder than it needs to be. Mom's being more than fair. Fair. There was nothing fair about losing my wife, my son, and my home all at once. But I signed anyway, too emotionally exhausted to fight a battle I knew I couldn't win. The day our divorce was finalized, Margaret and Richard didn't even look at me as they left the courthouse. I watched them walk to James's waiting luxury car, my son's arm around his mother's shoulders, both of them stepping easily into their new life, one that had no place for me. After the divorce, I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes from the high school where I taught. The space was functional, but impersonal, with beige walls and beige carpets. I didn't bother decorating at first, telling myself it was temporary until I found something better. But months passed, then a year, and still the only personal touches were a few framed photos of Richard as a child and some books stacked on the coffee table. According to our custody agreement, I was supposed to have Richard every other weekend. But at 17, nearly 18, Richard had his own ideas. He simply stopped showing up for our scheduled visits. I have SAT prep on Saturday, Dad, he would text. Or, coach scheduled an extra practice. Or sometimes nothing at all. I called Margaret about it once. He's practically an adult, Donald, she said dismissively. I can't force him to visit you if he doesn't want to. But you could encourage him, I replied. "You could remind him that I'm still his father." "That's between you and Richard," she said, before ending the call. Meanwhile, Margaret's career continued to flourish. She left her company to start her own real estate development firm, capitalizing on connections she had built over the years and a booming market. Within 2 years, her company was handling major commercial developments throughout the state. I would see her name in the business section of the local paper, or occasionally on a billboard advertising a new shopping center or luxury apartment complex. Richard graduated high school with honors and was accepted to Princeton, his mother's alma mater. I wasn't invited to the small celebration dinner Margaret hosted for him, learning about it only afterward from a mutual friend who didn't realize we were no longer on speaking terms. I sent Richard a card with a check the amount significant for my modest salary. The check was cashed, but I never received a thank you note or even a text. My depression, which had improved somewhat before the divorce, came roaring back with a vengeance. I continued teaching, finding solace in my classroom and my students, but the rest of my life felt empty. I went through the motions, grocery shopping, paying bills, occasionally meeting a colleague for coffee, but the joy had been leached from my days. I tried dating a few times, encouraged by well-meaning friends who insisted I needed to get back out there. But these attempts at connection always fizzled quickly. I couldn't open up, couldn't trust, couldn't imagine building something new when the ruins of my old life still smoldered around me. On Richard's 21st birthday, I called him, leaving a voicemail when he didn't answer. I had sent a gift card to a popular electronics store, knowing anything more personal would likely miss the mark. 3 days later, he called back, catching me between classes. "Thanks for the gift card, Dad," he said, his voice formal, as if speaking to a distant acquaintance. "You're welcome, Richard. I hope you're enjoying your birthday. How are your classes going?" "Good, busy. I'm double majoring in economics and business with a minor in finance." Following in his mother's ambitious footsteps. "That sounds challenging. I'm proud of you for taking on so much." A pause. "Mom's company is opening a new office in Boston. I might intern there next summer." Of course. Margaret was extending her empire, and Richard was being groomed to join it. "That's a great opportunity," I said, trying to sound supportive rather than hurt. "Yeah, well, I should go. I have a study group." The dismissal was clear. "Richard, wait," I said quickly. "I thought maybe we could get lunch sometime. I could drive up to Princeton on a weekend, or if you're coming home for Thanksgiving." "I'm going to Aspen with Mom and James for Thanksgiving," he interrupted. "Maybe another time." He hung up before I could respond, before I could tell him I missed him, that I loved him despite everything. A few months later, I had a chance encounter with Richard that proved even more painful. I was in a coffee shop near campus, grading papers on a Saturday afternoon. I had driven the 2 hours to Princeton on a whim, hoping that even if Richard wouldn't agree to meet me, I might catch a glimpse of him around town. And there he was, walking in with a group of friends, all of them dressed in expensive casual wear, laughing about something. My heart leapt at the sight of him, taller than I remembered, his face thinner, more adult. "Richard," I called out, standing up so he could see me. He turned, and the look of shock, followed quickly by embarrassment on his face, felt like a physical blow. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he asked as he approached my table, leaving his friends waiting by the counter. "I was in the area," I lied. "Thought I would grade some papers with a change of scenery." His eyes darted to his friends, clearly concerned they would witness this uncomfortable reunion. "You drove 2 hours to grade papers." His tone was skeptical, borderline hostile. "I also hoped I might run into you," I admitted, "since you're too busy for lunch." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his mother it made my chest ache. "This is weird, Dad. You can't just show up at my college town unannounced. I'm your father, Richard. Wanting to see you shouldn't be weird. Look, I've got to go. My friends are waiting." He glanced at them nervously. "Can you introduce me?" I asked, desperate to extend our interaction to be included in even this small part of his life. "That's not a good idea," he said quickly. "They're waiting for me." As he turned to leave, I reached for his arm. "Richard, please. Just 5 minutes." He jerked away from my touch, his face flushing with anger. "God, this is exactly why I don't answer your calls. You're so needy, so pathetic. Mum was right about you. You're a failure who can't move on with his life. Just leave me alone." He stormed off to his friends, leaving me standing there, humiliated and heartbroken. As they left the coffee shop, I could hear him explaining, "That was just my dad. Total loser. Couldn't hack it in the real world, so he teaches high school history and stalks me on weekends." The laughter of the group followed me as I packed up my papers with shaking hands and fled to the coffee shop. A week after that incident, I experienced chest pains and shortness of breath while teaching. A concerned colleague called an ambulance, and I was diagnosed with a minor heart attack, brought on by stress and untreated high blood pressure. Lying in that hospital room alone, except for a few visits from colleagues, I realized how completely I had lost everything that mattered to me. My marriage, my son, and now my health was beginning to fail as well. Over the next 15 years, I watched from a distance as Margaret built her real estate empire. What had started as a small local company grew into a regional powerhouse with developments in multiple states. Her name became synonymous with luxury condominiums and high-end commercial spaces. I followed her success through business journals, local news, and eventually social media. There she was cutting ribbons at grand openings, accepting awards at business functions, always immaculately dressed, always wearing the confident smile of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. Sometimes James would appear in these photos. Beside her, the two of them, the perfect power couple. They had married about 5 years after our divorce, in what the society pages described as the wedding of the season. I wasn't invited, of course, though Richard served as best man. My own attempts at relationships during this time were sporadic and unsuccessful. I dated a fellow teacher for almost a year, but my emotional unavailability eventually became too much for her. "It's like you're still married to your ex-wife, Donald," she said when she ended things. "Not because you love her, but because you're still fighting the battle of who was right and who was wrong." She wasn't entirely wrong. The injustice of how things had ended, of how Margaret had portrayed me to our son, still ate at me. I had been a good husband, a loving father. I had supported Margaret's career, even when it took her away from our family. My only crime had been struggling with depression after losing my parents and not sharing her ruthless ambition. My therapist suggested I needed to forgive Margaret, not for her sake, but for my own. "Holding on to this resentment is like drinking poison and expecting her to die," he said. Intellectually, I knew he was right, but emotionally I couldn't seem to let go. Richard graduated from Princeton with honors and immediately joined Margaret's company as a junior executive. According to the company newsletter, which I still masochistically read online, he was being groomed for leadership, working directly under his mother to learn all aspects of the business. I attended his graduation ceremony, sitting far in the back where I wouldn't be noticed. I wanted to at least witness this milestone in my son's life, even if I couldn't be part of the celebration. Afterward, I tried to approach him to offer congratulations, but he was surrounded by Margaret James and a group of their friends. When he spotted me making my way toward them, he whispered something to his mother. They quickly moved toward the parking lot, effectively avoiding any interaction. I was left standing alone among the dispersing crowd, the congratulatory card still in my pocket. A few years later, Richard married a woman named Julia, the daughter of one of Margaret's business associates. I learned about the engagement from the announcement in the local paper, complete with professional photos of the happy couple. No invitation to the wedding arrived, though I hadn't really expected one. I sent a gift anyway, a first-edition copy of The Great Gatsby that I had found at an antiquarian bookshop. Richard had loved the book when I taught it to his English class in 9th grade, before everything fell apart. The gift was returned to my apartment a week later, the packaging unopened with a note from Julia's personal assistant saying Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell regret that they cannot accept this gift. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell. My son had taken his stepfather's surname somewhere along the way, another erasure of our connection. My health continued to decline in small but noticeable ways. The stress and loneliness took their toll. I developed hypertension, insomnia, and recurring bouts of depression. At 58, I looked and felt a decade older. My doctor repeatedly warned me about the effects of chronic stress on my cardiovascular system, but knowing something is harmful doesn't always make it easier to address. When I reached 60, I made the difficult decision to retire from teaching. The job that had once been my lifeline, my one source of purpose and joy, had become increasingly taxing. My energy wasn't what it once was, and I found myself struggling to connect with students who seemed to grow younger as I grew older. The school organized a small retirement party. My colleagues were kind, reminiscing about my years of service, the students I had helped, the history club I had sponsored. One former student, now a history professor himself, sent a video message thanking me for inspiring his career choice. It was a bittersweet occasion. I was proud of my work as a teacher, but I couldn't help feeling that my professional accomplishments paled in comparison to Margaret's. She had buildings with her company's name on them, a fortune in the bank, and the respect of the business community. I had a modest pension, a collection of coffee mugs given to me by students, and an empty apartment to return to. 2 years into my retirement, my life consisted mainly of reading, taking long walks, and volunteering at the local historical society. I had adjusted to the solitude, if not embraced it when the call came that would change everything. It was a Tuesday morning in April when my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I might have let it go to voicemail, assuming it was a telemarketer, but something compelled me to answer. "Is this Donald Parker?" a formal male voice inquired. "Yes, this is he," I replied, setting down my coffee mug. "Mr. Parker, my name is Harold Thompson of Thompson, Williams and Associates. I represent the estate of Margaret Caldwell." My heart skipped a beat at the mention of Margaret's name. "I'm sorry, what did you say about Margaret?" There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Parker, I regret to inform you that Mrs. Caldwell passed away 3 days ago. She suffered a massive stroke while at her office. I understand this must come as a shock to you." I sank into my kitchen chair, the room suddenly spinning around me. Margaret dead. It seemed impossible. Margaret had always been so vital, so unstoppable a force of nature rather than a mere mortal. "Mr. Parker, are you there?" Thompson's voice broke through my stunned silence. "Yes, I'm here. I'm just surprised. She was only 58. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "Indeed, it was unexpected. Mrs. Caldwell had named my firm as the executors of her estate. I'm calling to inform you that your presence is requested at the reading of her will, which will take place this Friday at 2 p.m. at our offices." This was even more surprising. Her will? Why would I need to be there? We've been divorced for over 20 years. I'm not at liberty to discuss the contents of the will before the official reading, Mr. Parker. I can only tell you that Mrs. Caldwell specified that you should be present. After providing me with the address of his law firm and a few more formal details, Thompson ended the call, leaving me sitting in my silent kitchen, trying to process what I'd just learned. Margaret was gone. The woman who had been my wife for 25 years, the mother of my child. The person who had once known me better than anyone else in the world no longer existed. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the pain and betrayal, I felt a profound sense of loss. I found the obituary online later that day. It was lengthy and laudatory, detailing her business accomplishments, her philanthropic work, her role as a pioneering woman in real estate development. It mentioned her loving husband, James, and her devoted son, Richard, as well as her parents and a sister who lived overseas. There was no mention of her first husband, no acknowledgement that she had once been Margaret Parker for a quarter of a century. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday, the day before the will reading. I debated whether to attend, ultimately deciding that I should pay my respects, regardless of how our relationship had ended. She had been an important part of my life, and I needed the closure. The service was held at an elegant downtown chapel, the kind of place that matched Margaret's refined tastes. I arrived early and sat in the back row, hoping to remain inconspicuous. The chapel filled quickly with business associates, friends, and family. Richard entered with Julia, both dressed immaculately in black, her arm linked through his for support. He looked devastated, his normally confident posture slumped with grief. James followed shortly after, escorted by an older woman, who must have been his sister. His face was drawn, eyes red-rimmed from crying. Whatever else had happened, it was clear he had truly loved Margaret. Throughout the service I remained invisible, just another mourner among many. Various people spoke about Margaret's brilliance in business, her generosity, her vision for the future. A childhood friend shared stories of her determination even as a young girl. James gave a moving tribute to her as a wife and partner. When Richard took the podium, I leaned forward, hungry for any glimpse into the relationship my son had shared with his mother in the years I had been excluded. My mother taught me everything important I know. Richard began, his voice thick with emotion. She showed me that with hard work and vision, anything is possible. She never accepted limitations or excuses. She demanded excellence from herself and from everyone around her. It was a eulogy that painted Margaret as more of a mentor than a mother, focusing on the business values she had instilled rather than maternal warmth or family memories. I wondered if Richard even realized what was missing from his tribute, or if Margaret's version of motherhood had been so completely centered on ambition and success that he saw nothing unusual about it. After the service, I slipped out quickly, avoiding any potential awkward encounters. As I walked to my car, I caught sight of Richard, standing alone for a moment on the chapel steps, looking utterly lost despite being surrounded by people offering condolences. For a brief moment, I considered approaching him, offering the comfort of the one other person who knew what it was to love Margaret before she became a business mogul. But then Julia appeared at his side, and the moment passed. The next day, I dressed in my best suit, which was admittedly rather dated, and made my way to the offices of Thompson, Williams and Associates. The building was one of the most prestigious in downtown, all glass and polished steel. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors, a testament to their success and the caliber of clients they represented. I felt out of place as soon as I entered the opulent reception area, with its marble floors and museum-quality artwork. The receptionist, a poised young woman with an impeccable blowout, looked at me with barely disguised curiosity when I gave my name. Mr. Parker. Yes, you're expected for the Caldwell will reading. Please take a seat. Someone will come for you shortly. I sat in one of the leather armchairs, painfully aware of my scuffed shoes and the slight fraying at my shirt cuffs. After about 10 minutes, the elevator dinged, and Richard stepped out with Julia. He stopped short when he saw me, confusion, and then anger flashing across his face. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he demanded, striding toward me. I stood suddenly nervous. I was invited by Mr. Thompson for the will reading. Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've got to be kidding me. Why would Mom include you in her will?" "I don't know," I admitted. I was surprised by the invitation, too. Richard looked me up and down, taking in my outdated suit and graying hair. The last time we had been face-to-face was at his college graduation 7 years earlier, a non-interaction that had left me feeling hollow for months afterward. "Well, this should be interesting," he said with a smirk. "But Dad, you know you won't get anything right. Mom would never leave anything to you. She probably just wanted you to see what success really looks like." Before I could respond, a young man in an impeccable suit approached. "Mr. Caldwell, Mrs. Caldwell, Mr. Parker, Thompson is ready for you now. Please follow me." As we walked down the hallway, I could feel Richard's contemptuous gaze on my back. Whatever reason Margaret had for including me in this meeting, my son clearly believed it wasn't to my benefit. And given our history, I had little reason to think otherwise. We were led into a large conference room with a polished mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Already seated were James, looking somber in an expensive suit, and several people I didn't recognize, who I assumed were business associates or other beneficiaries. Harold Thompson sat at the head of the table, a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He had the commanding presence of someone accustomed to handling delicate matters for wealthy clients. Richard and Julia took seats next to James, while I was directed to a chair on the opposite side of the table, physically separated from the family unit they formed. "Now that everyone has arrived, we can begin," Thompson said, opening a leather portfolio in front of him. "We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Margaret Elaine Caldwell." He began with legal formalities, establishing that this was indeed Margaret's last will, properly witnessed and notarized. Then he moved on to the specific bequests. Margaret's longtime executive assistant received a generous cash gift of $200,000 and a letter of recommendation that Thompson described as glowing. Several other employees received smaller but still substantial amounts. Margaret's sister, who I had met only a few times during our marriage, was left a vacation property in Nantucket that I hadn't even known Margaret owned. To various charities and educational institutions, Margaret left a total of $3 million, including a significant endowment to Princeton for a scholarship fund in her name. As each bequest was read, I became increasingly confused about my presence. None of this had anything to do with me, and it was painful to sit through these reminders of the wealthy, successful life Margaret had built after leaving me behind. "To my husband, James Caldwell," Thompson continued, "I leave our primary residence in Westchester, the apartment in Manhattan, and the sum of $5 million. James nodded somberly, no surprise registering on his face. This was apparently what he had expected. Thompson then looked up, his gaze settling on Richard. "To my son, Richard Caldwell, I leave 40% of the shares in Caldwell Development Corporation and the sum of $10 million. Richard smiled slightly, exchanging a glance with Julia. This seemed to be in line with his expectations as well. Then he looked across the table at me. that same smirk from earlier playing on his lips. He clearly believed the proceedings were now complete, and I had been brought here merely to witness their good fortune. But Thompson cleared his throat and reached for a sealed envelope beside him. There is a codicil to Mrs. Caldwell's will executed and properly witnessed 1 week before her passing. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. James sat up straighter, and Richard's smirk faltered. "A codicil?" Richard asked. "What does that mean?" "It's an addition or modification to the will," Thompson explained patiently. "This was prepared at Mrs. Caldwell's specific request during our last meeting." He broke the seal on the envelope and removed several pages, along with what appeared to be a handwritten letter. "Before I read the legal language of the codicil, Mrs. Caldwell requested that I share this letter with all of you." Thompson put on his reading glasses and began. "If this letter is being read, then I am gone, and there are things I did not have the courage to say in life that must be said now. First to James. Thank you for 15 years of partnership and love. You came into my life when I was at my most driven and ambitious, and you matched me step for step. To Richard, my son. I have always been proud of your intelligence and determination, but I fear that in teaching you to value success and ambition, I failed to teach you equally important lessons about compassion and forgiveness. And to Donald, my first husband, and Richard's father, I owe the greatest apology. The narrative I created about our marriage and its end was self-serving and unjust. The truth is that you were a good husband and an exceptional father. Your depression after losing your parents was not weakness, as I characterized it, but normal grief that I was too impatient and self-absorbed to honor. I betrayed not only our marriage vows, but also the respect you deserved as a person and as Richard's father. Worse, I deliberately damaged your relationship with our son to assuage my own guilt and justify my actions. 3 months ago, I received a diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was poor from the beginning, though the stroke that ultimately took my life was unexpected. This diagnosis forced me to reflect on my life's choices and their consequences. What I have concluded is that despite all my material success, I failed in the most important aspects of life, integrity, loyalty, and love. The wealth I accumulated means little when weighed against the pain I caused and the relationships I destroyed. It is too late for me to make amends personally, but not too late to attempt some measure of justice through my final wishes. Thompson paused, looking around the table. Richard's face had drained of color, while James stared at his hands, his expression unreadable. Julia looked uncomfortable, as if she was witnessing something too private for her presence. Now to the legal portion of the codicil, Thompson continued. I, Margaret Elaine Caldwell, being of sound mind, hereby amend my last will and testament as follows. To my first husband, Donald Parker, I leave 40% of the shares in Caldwell Development Corporation, equal to the portion left to my son Richard, as well as the sum of $15 million. Furthermore, it is my explicit wish that Donald and Richard work together as equal partners in running Caldwell Development Corporation for a minimum period of 5 years following my death. Should either party refuse to honor this arrangement, their shares in the company shall be donated in full to the charitable foundation established in my name. The silence that followed was absolute. I felt as if I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I had just heard. $15 million. 40% of Margaret's company. It was unfathomable. Richard recovered first, slamming his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. She wasn't in her right mind. She was sick, probably on medication. This codicil, or whatever you call it, can't be legal. Thompson remained calm in the face of Richard's outburst. I can assure you, Mr. Caldwell, that your mother was entirely lucid when she executed this document. She underwent a thorough psychiatric evaluation specifically to prevent this kind of challenge. Then he coerced her somehow, Richard said, pointing at me accusingly. He must have contacted her when she was vulnerable, manipulated her. Your father had no contact with your mother prior to this amendment, Thompson said firmly. In fact, she specifically mentioned that they had not spoken in over 20 years. I don't believe it, Richard insisted, his face flushed with anger. My mother would never do this. She would never put him on equal footing with me in her company. He knows nothing about real estate. Perhaps that wasn't the point, Thompson suggested mildly. Richard stood up, pacing the room. I'll contest this. I'll take it to court. There's no way this holds up. Thompson sighed, removing his glasses. I anticipated this reaction, as did your mother. That's why she insisted on recording a video statement the day she signed the codicil with 3 independent witnesses present. Would you like me to play it for you? Richard stared at Thompson in disbelief, then turned to glare at me. You must be loving this, Dad. Your big revenge on us all. Well, enjoy it while you can, because I will never work with you. Never. He stormed out of the conference room, Julia hurrying after him. James remained seated, looking thoughtful rather than angry. I sat frozen in my chair, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. After 20 years of estrangement, of being treated as if I was worthless, Margaret had left me half her fortune and half her company, and she had tied it to a condition that seemed impossible to fulfill, a working relationship with the son who despised me. Mr. Thompson, I finally managed to say, I don't understand. Why would Margaret do this? Thompson gathered his papers deliberately before answering. Mrs. Caldwell came to see me shortly after her diagnosis. She was quite candid about the regrets she had regarding her first marriage and her son's relationship with you. This was her attempt to right what she saw as her greatest wrong. But Richard will never agree to work with me. You saw his reaction. Give him time, Thompson advised. This has been a shock for everyone, and regardless of whether the two of you can collaborate as Mrs. Caldwell wished the financial bequest to you stands independently. I shook my head, still struggling to process everything. I'm not sure I even want it. The money, the shares, any of it. That's entirely your decision, Mr. Parker. But may I suggest you take some time to consider Mrs. Caldwell was quite determined that this was what she wanted. In her words, it won't undo the damage I've done, but it might give Donald and Richard a chance to rebuild what I destroyed. As I left the law firm that day, my mind was in turmoil. After decades of feeling insignificant in comparison to Margaret's wealth and success, I had suddenly been handed a fortune. But the true value, the possibility of reconnecting with my son, seemed as distant as ever. I didn't go directly home after the will reading. Instead, I found myself wandering the city streets, trying to make sense of the day's events. By the time I returned to my apartment, it was nearly dark, and I was no closer to understanding my feelings about Margaret's surprising final act. The next morning, I received a call from Harold Thompson, asking if I could come back to his office to discuss next steps. When I arrived, I was surprised to find him alone without the junior associates who had been present at the will reading. I thought we might speak more candidly in private, he explained, gesturing for me to take a seat across from his desk. I've known Margaret for many years, Mr. Parker. I handled her divorce from you, in fact. This was unexpected. You were her divorce attorney. Thompson nodded. I was. And I want you to know that even then, She expressed certain regrets about how things were proceeding, particularly regarding your son. Unfortunately, once events were in motion, Margaret was not someone who easily changed course. That sounds like her, I agreed. But I still don't understand why, after all these years, she would do this. Margaret came to see me about 4 months ago, Thompson said, leaning back in his chair. She told me about her diagnosis and said she had been doing a great deal of thinking about her life. She asked me, as someone who had known her professionally for decades, whether I thought she had been a good person. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. I told her that she had been an excellent client, a formidable businesswoman, and a significant philanthropist. But as for being a good person, that was a more complicated question that only she could answer. And her answer was to leave me half her fortune. I asked, still incredulous. Not exactly. She talked a great deal about you that day, Mr. Parker. She admitted that she had systematically turned your son against you after the divorce, that she had painted you as weak and unsuccessful to justify her own actions. She spoke of following your life from a distance, knowing about your health problems, your early retirement. I was stunned. She kept track of me all these years. Apparently so. She mentioned that she had occasionally asked mutual acquaintances about you and in recent years had even hired a private investigator to ensure you were, well, still alive, I suppose. The idea that Margaret had been watching me from afar all this time was unsettling. If she felt so guilty, why didn't she ever reach out to me directly? Try to make amends while she was still alive? Thompson sighed. Pride, most likely. Margaret built her identity around being someone who never made mistakes, who never looked back. Admitting to you that she had wronged you would have meant confronting a version of herself she preferred to keep buried. And now I'm supposed to work with Richard, who clearly wants nothing to do with me. That is her wish, yes, but whether you and Richard can fulfill that wish remains to be seen. Thompson leaned forward, his expression serious. I should tell you, Mr. Parker, that your son has already been in contact with another law firm about contesting the codicil. My heart sank. So this is all going to end up in court after all? Not necessarily. The video testimony is quite strong, and as I mentioned, Margaret underwent a psychiatric evaluation specifically to prevent challenges based on mental competency. Still, these matters can become complicated. What do you suggest I do? Thompson considered for a moment. If you truly have no interest in the money or the company shares, you could simply walk away. Sign everything over to Richard or to charity as you prefer. That would certainly be the simplest solution. The suggestion gave me pause. Was that what I wanted? To decline Margaret's posthumous attempt at justice or reconciliation. It would certainly be easier than forcing a relationship with a son who had made his feelings about me abundantly clear. And if I don't walk away, I asked, then I suggest you try to speak with Richard, not about the business aspects yet, but as a father to a son who has just lost his mother. Whatever else has happened between you, that's a grief you can understand. I nodded, knowing he was right, but doubtful that Richard would be receptive to any overture from me. As I was leaving, Thompson said one more thing that stayed with me. Margaret told me something else during our conversation, Mr. Parker. She said that in all the years since your divorce, she had never found anyone who truly knew her the way you had, who had loved her for herself, rather than for what she had accomplished or could provide. I think that realization was at the heart of her decision. In the days that followed, I grappled with what to do about Margaret's bequest. The money alone was more than I could comprehend, let alone the responsibility of co-owning a major corporation. I consulted with a financial advisor who was practically giddy at the prospect of managing such a substantial portfolio. I spoke with another lawyer who confirmed that Margaret's codicil was likely to hold up in court, given the precautions she had taken. But the central question remained: did I want to accept this unexpected inheritance with all the complications it entailed? A week after the will reading, I made my decision. I would accept Margaret's bequest not primarily for the financial security it offered, but because it represented her acknowledgement of the wrong she had done. And perhaps, just perhaps, it might open a door to rebuilding some kind of relationship with Richard. I called Thompson to inform him of my decision. "I'm glad to hear it," he said. "And as for Richard, I'm going to try to talk to him," I replied, though I'm not optimistic. "He's scheduled to come in tomorrow to discuss some details of the estate. Would you like me to arrange for you to be here as well?" The thought of another confrontation with Richard made my stomach churn, but I agreed nonetheless. It was time to face this situation head-on, for better or worse. The next day, I arrived at Thompson's office 15 minutes early, my nerves making me restless. When Richard entered the conference room and saw me, he immediately turned to leave. "Mr. Caldwell," Thompson called out, "please join us. This concerns both of you, and the sooner we address it, the better for everyone." Richard hesitated, then reluctantly took a seat as far from me as possible. "I have nothing to say to him," he said coldly. "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "Just listen, please." Richard crossed his arms but remained silent, which I took as permission to continue. "I was as surprised by your mother's decision as you were," I began. "I had no idea she was ill, no idea she had been thinking about me or regretting anything about our past." "So you say," Richard muttered. I ignored the interruption. "I've given this a lot of thought, and I've decided to accept the inheritance. Not to hurt you or to take anything away from you, but because it was what your mother wanted." "What my mother wanted when she was dying and not thinking clearly," Richard shot back. "Mr. Thompson has explained that she was entirely lucid," I said gently. "And from what he's shared with me, she had been reflecting on her actions for some time." Richard shook his head dismissively. "So you're just going to waltz in and take half of what she built? A company you know nothing about. Money you did nothing to earn." The old hurt flared at his words, but I pushed it down. "I don't expect to have any active role in the company's operations. I know that would make no sense given my lack of experience in real estate. But I do hope that over time you and I might find a way to have some kind of relationship again." "That's never going to happen," Richard said flatly. "I'll buy out your shares. Name your price." Thompson cleared his throat. "I'm afraid that's not possible under the terms of the codicil, Mr. Caldwell. Your mother specifically prohibited the sale of either party's shares during the 5-year period of required collaboration." Richard's face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. You can't force two people to work together who have no desire to do so." "No one is forcing anything," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "But consider this, Richard. Your mother must have had a very compelling reason to make this her final wish. Don't you want to at least try to understand why?" For a brief moment, something flickered in Richard's eyes, a hint of uncertainty perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar contempt. "My mother made a mistake," he said firmly, "one I intend to correct through the courts if necessary." With that, he stood and walked out, leaving Thompson and me sitting in uncomfortable silence. "Well," Thompson said finally, "that could have gone better." I sighed heavily. "He hates me, has hated me for most of his adult life. I don't see how Margaret expected this to work." "Give it time," Thompson advised again. "Grief does strange things to people. And regardless of how he's behaving now, Richard has just lost his mother, his primary parent, and his business mentor all at once. That's a lot for anyone to process. I nodded, though I remained unconvinced. The gulf between Richard and me seemed as wide and impassable as ever. In the months that followed, I began to adjust to my new financial reality. I moved from my small apartment to a comfortable but not ostentatious condo. I set up a foundation to provide scholarships for underprivileged students interested in teaching careers. I even took a long postponed trip to Europe, something Margaret and I had always talked about doing someday during our marriage. But the situation with Caldwell Development Corporation remained unresolved. Richard had indeed filed a legal challenge to the codicil, which was proceeding slowly through the courts. Meanwhile, the company's board had appointed an interim CEO to manage day-to-day operations until the ownership dispute was settled. I was beginning to think that Margaret's plan for reconciliation had been hopelessly naive when I received an unexpected phone call from Julia Richards' wife. "Mr. Parker," she said hesitantly, "I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Mr. Thompson's office." "Not at all," I replied, surprised to hear from her. "Is everything all right?" There was a pause before she answered. "Not really. No. Richard has been struggling since Margaret died. The legal battle over the will is consuming him. He's not sleeping, barely eating. I'm worried about him." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said sincerely, "but I'm not sure what I can do to help. Would you be willing to meet with him? Somewhere neutral, just to talk?" The request took me by surprise. "Did Richard ask you to arrange this?" "No," she admitted. "He doesn't know I'm calling, but I think it might help if the two of you could speak directly without lawyers present." I agreed to the meeting, though I had serious doubts about whether Richard would show up once he learned I would be there. Julia arranged for us to meet at a private dining room in a quiet restaurant, promising she would make sure Richard attended. To my surprise, he did come, though his body language screamed reluctance as he entered the room where I was already seated. He looked thinner than when I had last seen him, with dark circles under his eyes, suggesting Julia's concerns about his sleep were well-founded. "Julia said this was important," he said by way of greeting, remaining standing. "I didn't know it would be you." "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Just for a few minutes. Then if you want to leave, I won't stop you." He hesitated, then grudgingly took a seat. "I don't see what there is to discuss. My lawyers are handling everything." "This isn't about the legal case," I said. "It's about you and me, father and son." Richard scoffed. "We haven't been father and son in any meaningful way for decades." "That's true," I acknowledged. "And a lot of that is on your mother, as her letter made clear. But some of it is on me, too. I should have fought harder to stay in your life after the divorce." "You couldn't even fight for your marriage," Richard said dismissively. "How are you going to fight for custody?" The criticism stung, but I recognized the defensive anger behind it. "I wasn't well after my parents died," I said quietly. "The depression was real and it affected my ability to stand up for myself. But that doesn't mean I didn't love you or that I ever stopped wanting to be part of your life." Richard looked away, his jaw tight. "It's a little late for that now." "Maybe," I conceded. "But your mother thought otherwise. She must have believed there was still a possibility for us to find some common ground." "My mother was dying and full of regret," Richard said. "That doesn't mean her solution makes any sense." We sat in silence for a moment, the tension between us almost palpable. Then, to my surprise, Richard spoke again, his voice slightly less hostile. "Why did you accept the inheritance? You could have walked away, made this all simpler." I considered my answer carefully, partly because after decades of being told I was worthless, it felt like vindication to have Margaret finally acknowledge that she had wronged me. but mostly because it seemed like the last best chance to reconnect with you in some way. Richard looked skeptical, and the $15 million had nothing to do with it. The money is nice, I admitted. I won't pretend otherwise, but I was managing before, and I would have continued to manage. What I couldn't seem to fix on my own was our relationship. Richard didn't respond immediately, seeming to turn my words over in his mind. Finally, he sighed heavily. I don't know how to do this. I've spent most of my life believing a certain narrative about you, about why our family fell apart. If that narrative isn't true, then what is? It was a surprisingly vulnerable admission, and I seized the opening it provided. Maybe we could figure that out together. Not as business partners necessarily, at least not yet, but just as two people trying to understand each other better. Richard still looked doubtful, but he didn't immediately reject the suggestion. I need to think about it. This is all a lot to process. Take all the time you need, I said. I'm not going anywhere. As he stood to leave, I took a risk and added, Julia mentioned you've been having a hard time since your mother died. If you ever want to talk about that, I'm here. I did love her once, you know. For many years. A flicker of something softer crossed Richard's face. I know you did, he said quietly. And then he was gone. That conversation was the first small crack in the wall between us. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was a beginning. 2 weeks later, Richard called me. His voice was strained, almost unrecognizable. Julia left me, he said without preamble. She said I've become obsessed with the will, with fighting you, with proving Mom wrong. She said she can't live with someone so consumed by anger. My heart went out to him, despite our difficult history. I'm very sorry to hear that, Richard. Where are you now? At home. Our home. I guess it's just mine now. He sounded lost, bewildered by this new development. Would you like company? I offered, fully expecting him to refuse. There was a long pause. Yes, he said finally. I think I would. I went to Richard's penthouse apartment that evening, bringing takeout from a deli I remembered he had liked as a teenager. He looked even worse than at our last meeting, disheveled and clearly not having showered for days. We ate mostly in silence, but afterward, perhaps loosened by the glass of scotch he had poured himself, Richard began to talk. He spoke about Julia, about their marriage, which had apparently been struggling even before Margaret's death. He talked about the pressure of working for his mother's company, always feeling he had to prove himself worthy of the Caldwell name. And eventually he circled back to me. She talked about you sometimes, you know. Mum. Not often, but occasionally, especially after a few drinks. What did she say? I asked, both dreading and curious to hear the answer. Mixed things. Usually it was the same old story about how you couldn't handle real life, how you held her back. But sometimes she would mention something specific, like how you used to bring her coffee in bed every morning, or how you were the only person who could make her laugh when she was really stressed. These small memories from our life together hit me with unexpected force. We had good years, I said softly, before things fell apart. Richard nodded, staring into his glass. I don't remember much from before the divorce, just fragments. You teaching me to ride a bike, Mom and you dancing in the kitchen. He looked up suddenly. Was it good before? It was very good, I said honestly. We were happy, the three of us. Your mother and I loved each other deeply for many years. Then what happened? He asked, sounding suddenly like the child he had been when our family fractured. If it was so good, why did it all go so wrong? I spent the next hour telling Richard the story of his parents' marriage, from my perspective being careful not to vilify Margaret, but also not sugarcoating her betrayal or the way she had manipulated him against me. He listened intently, occasionally asking questions or offering his own memories of the same events. When I finally left his apartment around midnight, nothing had been resolved about the will or the company, but a real conversation had taken place between father and son for the first time in decades. Over the next few months, Richard and I continued to meet regularly. Sometimes we discussed practical matters related to Caldwell development, with Richard explaining aspects of the business and me offering suggestions based on my experience as an educator and community member. Other times we simply talked about our lives, gradually filling in the vast gaps in our knowledge of each other. The legal challenge to Margaret's codicil was dropped by mutual agreement. Instead, we decided to honor her wishes, though on our own terms. Richard would remain the operational head of the company, while I would serve on the board and take responsibility for the company's educational and community outreach initiatives areas where my background actually provided valuable perspective. Working together wasn't always smooth. We had serious disagreements about business strategy and corporate culture. Richard had been shaped by Margaret's aggressive profit-first approach, while I advocated for more consideration of environmental and social impacts. But these conflicts, rather than driving us apart, actually helped us develop a more balanced way of interacting, learning to respect each other's viewpoints, even when we didn't agree. The personal healing took longer. Richard had 20 years of ingrained habits regarding how he viewed me, and those didn't change overnight. I had my own lingering resentments about being shut out of his life during crucial years. But gradually, with effort on both sides, we began to build something new. Not the father-son relationship we might have had without the intervention of Margaret's manipulations, but a relationship nonetheless. 3 years after Margaret's death, Caldwell Development was thriving under our joint ownership, with a new emphasis on sustainable building practices and affordable housing components in our luxury developments, changes that had actually enhanced rather than detracted from the company's profitability. Richard and Julia reconciled after a 6-month separation, having worked through their issues in couples therapy. They were expecting their first child, a girl they planned to name after both grandmothers, Elizabeth Margaret. As for me, I found a new purpose in my unexpected late-in-life wealth. Beyond the educational foundation I had established, I became involved in advocacy for mental health awareness, sharing my own story of how untreated depression had contributed to the collapse of my marriage and family. I even started dating again a retired literature professor named Sarah, who shared my love of history and travel. One evening, Richard and I were having dinner at my condo reviewing plans for a new mixed-use development the company was considering when he suddenly set down his papers and looked at me intently. "Do you think Mom knew this would happen?" he asked, "that forcing us to work together would actually lead to us reconciling, I guess?" I considered the question carefully. "I don't know if she predicted exactly how things would unfold," I replied, "but I think she hoped that by creating a situation where we had to interact, she might give us the opportunity to see each other as we truly are, rather than through the distorted lens she had created." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "It's strange to think that her final act was to undo her own work in a way, to try to rebuild what she had deliberately torn down." "People are complicated," I said. "Your mother was brilliant and driven, but also capable of great harm to those she claimed to love. And yet in the end, she found the courage to acknowledge that harm and try to make amends in the only way she could. I miss her." Richard admitted a vulnerability he rarely showed. "Despite everything, despite knowing now how she manipulated me against you, I still miss her." "Of course you do," I said gently. "She was your mother. She loved you in her way, even if that love was flawed. We can acknowledge the harm someone has done while still honoring the genuine love that also existed. Richard's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thank you for not making me choose, for not making me pick sides between you and her memory. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand, this grown man who was once again in some meaningful way my son. There are no sides anymore, Richard. Just two people who both loved you each in our own imperfect way. I lost my wife in our divorce and my son to her manipulation. But in the end, through Margaret's final act of contrition, I regained the relationship that mattered most. The money and the company shares were substantial. Yes, but the true inheritance was this: the chance to know my son as an adult, to be known by him in return, and to finally heal the wounds of our shared past. Sometimes the greatest gifts come when we least expect them, and from the most unlikely sources. In my case, it took my ex-wife's deathbed revelation to restore what she had spent decades destroying. And while I would never claim that Margaret's final act erased all the pain she caused, it did offer something I had long ago given up hoping for a second chance at being a father. What about you? Have you ever received an unexpected second chance that changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. And if this tale of reconciliation touched your heart, please hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to heal old wounds. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't measured in dollars, but in restored relationships.